Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast, where we bring global, diverse voices to help us frame a sensible, fair, and democratic AI regulation and governance around the world. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Paul Uithol with us. Paul is the head of data with the Humanitarian Open Team, Open AI team.
OpenStreetMap Team.
Okay, OpenStreetMap Team. And Paul, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. For our global audience, can you just tell them what does the OpenStreetMap team do and your role in this briefly?
Yes. So thanks for introducing Sanjay. Pleased to be here today. I work with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team as our director of data, indeed. And Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team is an organization that focuses on providing geospatial data and maps to aid in humanitarian crisis and disaster response to the UN system, to nonprofits, to governments. We mostly focus on the global south as a colloquial term. The correct term is middle lower income countries, essentially. Sure. We focus on areas where there's a distinct lack and gap in data. So what our intention is to ensure that lack of data and inequity in data should not be a cause for exclusion of people in humanitarian aid and disaster response. So what we do is essentially collect data in an open platform, OpenStreetMap mostly, in order to provision and supply the data to the ones responding to either humanitarian crisis, conflict, displacement, refugee crisis, and disaster response. So the effects of earthquakes, hurricanes, etc., and ensuring that we have the data that's in place to be providing necessary aid to affected populations. So what it looks like in practice is that we'd either work from satellite imagery to ensure that base maps are up to date, that we know where populations, where people live, essentially, how they can be reached via the road network, if they have access to food, water, sanitation, education, healthcare services. Now, there's a part of that that you can derive from satellite imagery, mostly kind of the physical infrastructure, roads, buildings. Other parts, you're going to need to work with local populations to know, to identify what are the names of villages, how can they be best reached, what do people have and what do they not have access to, what is their ability to cope with natural disaster. And our role in that is essentially kind of as a data provisioning agency. We're kind of in the middle. We don't ourselves venture into the middle of those responses. We try to ensure that the ones that are doing that have all the data at their disposal that they need to be effective. So that's in short what we do. We do have staff in 4 regional hubs in Manila, Nepal, kind of a combination in the AP region, out of Nairobi, out of Dakar, and in Latin America. So in that sense, we've come quite a long way from being essentially a couple of white folks trying to do this from afar to really ensuring that this is something that integrates with the populations that we try to help, that we connect to local government agencies around, say, the National Disaster Risk Management Councils, and that we do this from a more local perspective, because ultimately those maps and the data in and of itself don't mean a whole lot. You need to understand how people use the data, how they identify places, villages, how they navigate in order to ensure they have the data that's actually relevant locally.
Very important work. Now, Paul, for our audience, how is AI changing the work that is done? And let's say you said these regions have traditionally maybe don't have the resources. You're working primarily in Global South to access it. How is AI changing some of the work that you're doing with geospatial data, especially with natural disasters? Tell our audience just briefly on that.
Yeah, it is in several ways. Now, creating maps, I mean, it's a field with a long history, like that goes back millennia, but it used to be very manual labor. And up until a couple of years ago, the way we were creating maps, like updating maps, was essentially taking the satellite imagery and drawing the buildings by hand. And machine learning has really taken, I won't say bite, but it's really a different way of looking at the same data. And it can be much more effective at times to be using machine learning data sets of, say, buildings, rather than trying to digitize those by hands. It is, however, always a trade-off between speed, effectiveness, efficiency, and quality of the outputs. So I think it's been improving massively, like the quality of ML data sets. But we're still at the point that we need to be really careful which data set we're picking, which data set we're integrating, figuring out where we need to improve data by hand. For example, a lot of these, that's where some of the limitations come in. A lot of these data sets have been mostly trained on data sets from North America and Western Europe. Real trouble identifying what a village in Uganda looks like, or what we saw pretty acutely last year in Turkey Syria earthquake. Syrian cities with the kind of courtyards, walls, style houses are very different from Western houses. And it was just at a loss at how to identify those. So that's one area, say machine learning on remote sensing data sets, so either satellite or plane service or whatever. Another chunk is on more kind of the user side. How do you access and use data? And the humanitarian system as a whole is quite fragmented. But there are some kind of key touch points in that, like the Humanitarian Data Exchange, which is a platform run by UN OCHA, the Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs. That's kind of a central repository for data used in humanitarian responses. They're doing a lot of work on also kind of the user side, and how do we make sense of these sometimes disparate data sets, incompatible data standards and data formats, and using AI to try to sweep those into kind of more standardized formats across sectors, across users. For example, around what you often do in the aftermath of disaster is do a needs assessment, look who's affected, what they have, what they're lacking, and etc. But different agencies do it in different ways. They publish the results in an Excel sheet or a PDF or whatever, and trying to kind of then collate the data coming out of that. Something closer to what we're doing is also looking at users in identifying or also predicting the effects of certain events, say hurricanes, on the road networks. What's going to be inundated, what's going to be swamped, what's going to be swept away in roads, bridges, whatever. And what does it mean for accessibility after an event? And maybe easier ways for people to use maps. At the moment, it's still, you need some technical skill in order to be able to use these data sets. Like taking a geo package or a shapefile, translating it into an actual analysis and then into decision-making data is still a bit of a, it's a profession. And it can be made much more accessible if you have easier prompts and ways for people to use the data, where I think AI also has a role to play.
So, Paul, you're dealing with all large volumes of data collected, whether it's geo or others. So two questions on that. One is, you're dealing in, obviously, in some highly vulnerable areas, working on, disasters and other kinds of things. How do you make sure this data is protected and does not get in the, let's just put it this way, there could be people who might utilize it for the wrong purposes. So for our audience, explain that part. Then I have another question on this data too.
So that is a tricky balance, obviously. We also, an additional complication is that we mostly deal in open data.
Yeah.
So anything we publish, we need to ensure that it's safe, for lack of a better word. Also now, but also we need to look into the future. Like, this data can be abused in 5 years to target different populations. We also have an issue and a problem. So there's different ways of dealing with that. We have our own data protection framework. So anything that we do in these types of interventions, we do first do a quick assessment, like looking at the context. Is it a high risk or low risk context? What types of conflicts are there locally? Are there maybe some local conflicts? And that's anything from safe context to poverty, which is, can be a concern in and of itself. By exposing what people have, you also, expose their wealth or the lack of that, to full-blown conflict, essentially. So in general, we'd look at like the contextual factors, what are the risk factors, then what data is safe to produce and publish and what isn't. And there's definitely a lot of stuff that is not safe to publish on open data platforms, because even something that sounds kind of innocuous, like the names of places or villages, can expose, like, it can essentially give you kind of a language map and be providing visibility on where ethnic minorities live within an area, subject to either conflict, displacements, natural disaster. So you need to have a lot of contextual information on the context, and information from people living there, also perhaps some different perspectives to help you understand what is safe to do and what isn't, what we can gather and publish, and how we can share the data. And that's a huge concern across the humanitarian space, of course. I mean, there's in each humanitarian response, you find protection officers, people charged with figure out like, how do we best ensure that the people that are affected by the situation are protected from any misuse of their data, can fall victim to fraud or wars, etc. For us, it's mostly like that process.
Mm-hmm. So, Paul, just on the follow-up question to that is, do you work with other intergovernment agencies also? Because this is,
yep.
Providing data is there, but in terms of solutions when there is a natural disaster, whether it's a Red Cross or other UN and other places, do you work with some of them?
Yeah, so yes, in short, we work with a number of actors in the UN system, often with their GS units. So the UNHCR GS unit in Copenhagen, the WFP one in Rome, the OCHA office in Istanbul. We also work a lot within a consortium that is called Missing Maps, which is essentially focused on like identifying where there's big gaps in data and ensuring that we start getting better data in there as kind of a preventative forward-looking measure, which is a consortium between ourselves, American Red Cross, British Red Cross, and MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières. So we work with a lot of those organizations which we essentially recognize that we have a shared problem. This is not anyone's problem in isolation. It's something that as a sector we need to ensure there's good data available for interventions, and also ensure that we're able to direct aid towards those that are most needing it. So we work within a lot of those international coordination mechanisms. Specifically, we also co-chair part of the Information Management Working Group, which is run by you and OCHA, which is essentially coordination body across a number of the actors working in the data space in the humanitarian sector.
Wow. Paul, in terms of, as you said, you're doing some mission critical work on disaster recovery. Have you been able to measure some, and I don't know, we want to use the word benefits, but the value for some of this data that have happened in real life disaster? Has that some kind of, and I don't want to use the word return on investment because that's a corporate term, but is there something that you think has been of tremendous value? Because I think it is of tremendous value.
Yes. Yeah, there's different ways of looking at it. On the one hand, there's consultancy companies that are providing a lot of doing research into like what is the value of open data. One of the pitfalls in the space is that people assume that data, by virtue of being open, is also somehow free to collect, grade, etc. It is not. Big surprise. And OpenStreetMap specifically as a platform, I think there's been some research for either Deloitte or Accenture showing that essentially the value of the entire ecosystem is several billion, but also that the return on investment of creation of open data is like about $20 return on investment to $1 invested in open data ecosystems. That's kind of the high level ecosystem research, I guess. On the one hand, we also have a lot of more empirical evidence from people using this data, telling us that it's been absolutely crucial to their operations. So a good example, I think, is the big earthquake last year in Turkey and Syria, where the data we created in any such disaster, the first 48 hours are crucial, right? That's the period when you have the most need for search and rescue, finding people under the rubble and trapped somewhere. They were immediately able to integrate OpenStreetMap data, even though Turkey's difficult context, where there's a lot of regulatory pressure from the government on what data is suitable for use. But we were able to provide them with a lot of up-to-date data from OpenStreetMap, with our volunteers all working, day and night to getting that to the best possible level, which they then were able to use immediately in the search and rescue operations in the first, week or so after the earthquake. We give a lot of essentially stories from people telling us like, hey, this data was absolute. Without this data, we would not have been able to get these people out from under rubble. It's always difficult to prove, though, when you work in a data setting, because we're not the ones actually providing aid, the ones actually running the vaccination campaigns, the ones providing the food aid, the ones providing search and rescue are organizations that we help with data. We're just a small part of the puzzle, but it is crucial to have that data available for them to be effective and be moving in the right direction towards, the areas where it's most needed, where they can actually provide that aid. Yeah.
Wow. Paul, I think listening to you, I hope our listeners understand that AI is not just using it for cool chatbots, but for helping vulnerable communities in terms of disaster recovery. And really, thank you for the work that you are doing for so many regions and places which would not have access to this data. And thank you really for being on this podcast, Paul. For our audience, applications of AI can be found in so many great places. And that's why in Regulating AI, we highlight these folks so that we build strong governance frameworks for doing this, Paul.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that last part is also very crucial. One thing that we're actually working on is also supplying, working with the people creating these AI models, but also creating our own version of those, which is actually usable by communities themselves. So not AI systems aren't something that's done onto them, but that have some power and agency in themselves. And for example, in creating some of the training data which goes into these AI models, there has to be, I think longer term, there also has to be some agency and autonomy for people themselves to be able to utilize these AI models. So it's not just something that's owned by big tech and run globally, but also that people can benefit from at a more local scale using data workflows that they control and create and understand. So.
Amazing. Paul, thank you so much. We need to get you back again for a more detailed, deep dive into some of those applications and how other folks can also collaborate with you. But thanks for taking the time.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.